United States is now preparing for large-scale combat operations against a near-peer adversary, and that is a huge shift from 20 years of counterinsurgency operations that we conducted in Iraq and Afghanistan. That shift takes time. It necessarily takes time. We've developed doctrinal initiatives such as multi-domain operations. The OPFOR at our combat training centers are now being realigned along Russian and Chinese models. It is a huge shift that we are undertaking, and it's important to remember that in those 20 years of counterinsurgency doctrine development, there's been an enormous technological shift. There are weapons available today and ability to use those weapons in large-scale combat operations that were virtually unimaginable on September 10th, 2001. So the United States is realigning to prepare for this kind of conflict, but it is a huge shift in terms of doctrine, in terms of mindset, and also in terms of technology.
There's nobody that should say they're an expert on China. All of us get it wrong. All of us have gotten it wrong. China is unbelievably complex and has changed significantly over time.
It's important, if you really want to understand the Chinese military, to understand a little bit about their history.
China perceives that historically they've been a great and powerful nation, one of the, if not the most powerful nations in the world. This was largely shaken by a historical period they call the Century of Humiliation, basically from the First Opium War to the rise of the current PRC. They want to return to that status, and they've had a number of ways they've captured that. Xi Jinping called it the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and they've set 2049, the centenary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, to reach this great rejuvenation. And what they want is for the People's Republic of China to hold a preeminent global position across a whole broad spectrum of endeavors, be it military, science and technology, economic, finance, you name it. They want China to be at the pole position across these categories of success.
The rise of the communist movement can go back to at least 1921. That's when the party was formed. Mao was an early adherent to communist philosophy, but he didn't rise to prominence at the outset. He was just one of many. It would later be more the responsibility of Red Army losses that led to Mao's elevation to the position that he eventually enjoyed. His military prowess wasn't terribly great. He was more of a political thinker than a military thinker. And he had actually been demoted at one point due to not so great Red Army performance. However, later defeats, when he was not in charge, actually helped re-elevate him to a leadership position. And then from a historical hindsight kind of perspective, he was elevated later to having a military prowess that really he wasn't deserving of, but he served as a focal point for uniting the people behind the idea of communism.
So the PLA under Mao, so we're going now back to the 1920s up through the late 1970s. It was a revolutionary army. It was a mob of conscripts or semi-conscripts and politically oriented officers. And their main interest was just defending Chinese territory proper in the same way, which was, you come into China, well, we're going to let you come in here, and then we're going to grind you down, and that's how we're going to do this. That's the people's war. That's the people of China defending China from outside aggression. And that was how Mao wanted it. That was his philosophy.
Mao Zedong was a very doctrinaire communist. He wanted to see a state that existed in perpetual revolution, this constant purifying of true communism in which everything was equal across the board. The old landed estates, the former elite were done away with, that everybody went down to the countryside and learned from the peasants. Chiang Kai-shek was the nationalist Chinese leader. He was the brother-in-law of Sun Yat-sen, the founder of the Republic of China. Sun did not live very long after the founding of the Republic of China. He developed stomach cancer, passed away in 1925. Chiang assumed his mantle of leadership. He wanted to build a stronger China. However, to do that, he saw the communists as an existential threat.
Chiang Kai-shek's an interesting figure. Chiang Kai-shek goes all the way back to the demise of dynastic rule in China, and he becomes affiliated with Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen is essentially the father of the republic in China. We're talking 1911 to 1912. But Sun Yat-sen is not in a particularly powerful position, and he's vying for power amongst many in the demise of dynastic rule and whatnot. And consequently, there will form among Sun Yat-sen and his followers and others in the South, be they communist or nationalist, Sun Yat-sen being a nationalist, Chiang Kai-shek being a nationalist. Between the nationalists and communists, they will decide to go north, a northern expedition basically, to exterminate, if you will, warlordism in China. Things are going okay for a little while, but in 1927, Chiang Kai-shek, again an opportunist, always looking forward, thinking balance of power, he uses an opportunity in the Northern Expedition, and he turns on his communist allies. And it's from that point that Mao is convinced the communists in the future need a vanguard army of their own to defend the communist ideology, communist leaders, but also to spread communist ideology. So that's where the beginning of the PLA is.
Workers and Peasants' Red Army, as the communist military wing was initially called, was founded on August 1st, 1927. Ba-yi, that's the characters that are still on their symbol today. And of course, the modern PLA traces its lineage back to that organization. The purpose of the PLA is to safeguard the sovereignty and the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. It's important to remember that the PLA is an instrument of the party, not of the Chinese state. And that's a key distinction between it and the United States Army.
Chiang Kai-shek, after he attacks the communists and there's a division between them, he will eventually embark on 5 extermination campaigns against the communists. This 5th extermination campaign will culminate in something called the Long March. And it's the Long March that is now celebrated amongst communist leaders, the Communist Party and whatnot, as this galvanizing event. If you were on the Long March, your political ascendancy was assured because you were a survivor. And the only thing that saved the communists at that point was the Japanese. Because in 1937, of course, the Japanese will invade China. And this becomes a moment where even Chiang Kai-shek's allies in the nationalists say, we have to stop persecuting the communists.
For a long time, Chiang Kai-shek continued to see the communists as a greater threat to his government than the invading Japanese. And this was even after the Japanese invaded Lower China in 1937 and start to work their way up the Yangtze River Valley. At the end of 1936, he is actually kidnapped and held at gunpoint by one of his own subordinate generals to force him to agree to a united front with the communists. He's that averse to the idea. He agrees to do it, won't commit it to writing. The communists agree to subordinate themselves to nationalist command and reflag themselves as the National Revolutionary Army. The Chinese at times, the communists, refuse to follow Chiang's orders from Chongqing. If they don't feel like this is something tactically and operationally beneficial to the communists, they just don't do it. They actually don't do a whole lot against the Japanese for long periods of time.
But when the war terminated, You can imagine the devastation on the Chinese side. But right away, the Civil War resumes itself. And so you have this battle for ascendancy between the communists under Mao and the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek. And what you see is a waning of the nationalist effort and a gaining of the communist effort. And of course, it culminates October 1, 1949, with the formation of the People's Republic of China. And Chiang Kai-shek is forced to retreat to Taiwan, a situation that we're still dealing with in 2022.
1979, when I get to the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Chinese had attacked into Vietnam with around 11 corps, 30-plus divisions. How many actually went into Vietnam and how many didn't is still much under debate. The casualties are still under debate. But they went down to teach their Vietnamese little brothers, in a Confucian sense, a lesson. They achieved their operational objectives that they had set out beforehand. And in 6 weeks, and then they turned around and retreated back into China. So in Vietnam, they learned that their military wasn't worth a damn. And so Deng Xiaoping said, I want to streamline the PLA. And he immediately began to make changes in the PLA in terms of how it was organized and how it trained and how it was equipped. Everything that they had back then was former Soviet stuff from the 50s. And so now they had to get ahead. So in the 80s, the United States is selling them military equipment. We sold them ANTPQ-37s. We sold them Blackhawks, the civilian S-70 Charlie version. The Navy, looked at selling them engines for frigates or destroyers, and then the Air Force had an F-A-2 program. So in the 80s, we were near allies with them because the Soviet Union was our enemy, and that put a lot of pressure on Russia or the Soviet Union, when China was coming up. So we, through the 80s and 90s, helped the Chinese economy, helped the Chinese military, and basically set them on the path that they're on today, which was a rejuvenation.
So they start this era of modernization. I usually place this at about 1980, give or take, when we can mark that on the wall as when the PLA decided it's time to modernize. So as we move forward, Chinese military thinking evolves very, very quickly after 1991. And we start to see their movement from the Corps as their basic unit of operation, and they neck that down to the brigade like most of the rest of the world was doing. And this continues to evolve through the 2000s, and eventually we wind up in 2015 with what is now looking like one of the seminal moments in the history of the PLA, and that was the establishment of the PLA as a true joint force.
PLA has always been organized to meet the party's goal. It is not the nation's army, it is the party's army. The Chinese Communist Party is the organizational instrument. Within that, you have the Politburo and the Standing Committee of the Politburo, and you have at the apex Xi Jinping, who took power in the 2012-2013 timeframe.
Xi Jinping, in addition to being president of China, is head of the Central Military Commission. The two vice chairs of the Central Military Commission that report directly to Xi are the senior uniformed members of the People's Liberation Army. He has a much more hands-on role in terms of the focus and direction of the PLA, for example, than the President of the United States does in the U.S. military.
Xi Jinping seems to be on a directed path, or is directing a path to really increase China's, I would say, global influence.
He takes a much more aggressive stance with regard to Chinese territoriality claims. We begin to hear about the 9-dash line a lot. We see the beginnings of the creation of artificial islands, brutal, aggressive stance against many nations that have competing claims on islands within the South China Sea. And today, China claims roughly 85 to 90% of the South China Sea. Xi Jinping has been adamant that China will not back down on these territorial claims. And he's backed that up, not just with rhetoric, but he's massively funded the People's Liberation Army, which includes the Army, Navy, and Air Force, and missile forces.
Xi Jinping is the head of the Central Military Commission. In that role, the PLA is his to command. It looks like an oligarchy, smells like an oligarchy, but it doesn't taste like an oligarchy. It's Xi Jinping. And he commands that organization and what it does and doesn't do. And I don't see anybody stopping him from doing it. So the PLA's different roles within their strategy is first to defend their sovereign territory and then do whatever they need to do internally to have stability.
So the phrase great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation is tied back to Xi Jinping, but this simply is reflective of longer-term initiatives that go all the way back to Mao. Each successive Chinese ruler has had a different way of phrasing what they sought, but all of them seek this return to a great power status that China had in history, in their view, and then lost.
So what does he want? He said he wants China to return to its proper place in history. And the last 200 years have been an aberration, where China has not been one of the global powers. If you go back in their history, the very name China, Zhongguo, is the center country, and that's how they see themselves. The question is, what does that mean? Does that mean that China owns, runs, and dictates to the world? Or does China just want to have influence around the world to protect its own interests?
China, in a lot of ways, views everyone as a competitor. That's one of their inheritances from Mao's worldview and it makes some sense considering their history and so on. They've been pretty consistently surrounded by people who want to do them harm going back literally thousands of years. So they have a fairly antagonistic view of most of the world, and particularly those around them that they view themselves in competition with. And that has influenced their military doctrine, as one might expect. The way that they built their military, they modernized their military, was through a series of phases, if you will. And the phases, they started with what they call a local war, which is just a conflict against a relatively weak regional adversary, then bump that up to a regional war, which is a regional conflict potentially against multiple adversaries, and then finally a total war, a World War II style cataclysmic event where it's two major industrial opponents fighting to the bitter end type of thing. And so the idea of competition is it's rooted in these different tiers.
The PLA's roles are changing to become a more modern force. Their recent white papers, the last couple of them, I believe in 2017 and 2019, highlighted the increasing need of some power projection capabilities for the PLA. As China goes out through its Belt and Road Initiative, it will create need for security of some of its development initiatives, and they want to be able to project power as needed to defend those. Additionally, they are increasingly building joint structures into their organizations. One of the key changes in the 2016 reforms was to take the 7 military regions and turn them into 5 what they call combat theaters. A couple of these are actually commanded by naval officers, which is a first in PLA military history.
The various policy changes that we've seen coming from the PLA over the last 15 or 20 years, it looks to outsiders like these guys are being much more belligerent, like they are being much more offensive, if you will, or much more proactive in the way that they're doing things, particularly in the Western Pacific, but really in lots of different areas. And the Chinese argument is, hey, this is all part of active defense. We are building strategic depth, and that strategic depth is necessary to defend our territory from increasingly capable opponents. So they tend to modify what they deem acceptable under the active defense concept, sort of based on what they're doing at the time. Maybe active defense now is we need to build some air bases and missile bases out in the near seas.
One key tenet of active defense is to stop adversary force buildups on its border. China has invested great time and effort into developing what we call anti-access area denial weapon systems to preclude the ability of a force buildup on its periphery. China perceives that it's encircled. There's U.S. military installations on Okinawa, in the main islands of Japan. We previously had a fairly substantial presence in the Philippines. They're surrounded by nations that are at best neutral and in some cases overtly hostile to China's intentions. Their part of active defense is what they call counterintervention, the ability to preclude any adversary from being able to project power into China's periphery.
Active defense now, it's China, their national policy remains the same now as it did during the Mao era, which is one of self-defense. And to be clear, this is Chinese policy. This is what they say. This is not necessarily reflective of their activities in the world. But their policy is we act only in self-defense, and that is our everything that we do is based on this idea of defending Chinese sovereignty, Chinese territory. However, we recognize, having watched, for instance, things like Desert Storm and other examples of modern combat power, that if we are passive in the way that we approach defending ourselves, we will not be able to defend ourselves. We can't just sit back and let someone build combat power on our borders and then choose the time and place of their attack. So active defense now is more reflective of this idea of using the tactical offense to keep one's opponent off balance as a part of a broader defensive strategy.
China defines the first island chain as that which runs down the main islands of Japan, through Taiwan and the Philippines, and then through the main Indonesian archipelago. They also have what's called the second island chain, which runs down the east side of the Philippine Sea through the Marianas and the Caroline Islands, also out to the Solomons and New Guinea. So China wants to develop the ability to project power further afield to defend its interests under the Belt and Road Initiative. As of right now, their primary effort has been to shore up their periphery and to dominate inside the first island chain, to be able to project power out to the second island chain. It is certainly something they have in their sights as what they want to develop. Right now, their capacity to project power beyond the second island chain is fairly rudimentary, but given the speed and scope of their military developments thus far, it would not surprise me to see them develop the ability to project power beyond the second island chain in the coming next couple of decades. One key change in the PLA's training is with regard to their ground forces. They've adopted a U.S. model for their combat training centers. Previously, military exercises were very scripted affairs that were designed to make the respective military commanders look good and show that they knew what they were doing. Now, they're introduced to full spectrum chaos, much like you would see at a U.S. combat training center. It's not so much to make the leadership look good, but to highlight weaknesses and sharpen those organizations to be more effective in combat. The key scenario that they're training for is to resume control specifically over areas over which they feel they have sovereignty, and Taiwan would be the key example of that. They do a number of exercises that reflect forcible entry and seizure of an island. What they want to be able to do is be able to project so much power in their periphery so rapidly that it would give the United States or any other potential opponent pause before and deter us or whomever from attempting to conduct any kind of operations in China's backyard.
China is a near peer in many respects. In others, it's not there yet. Remember that the United States has a global strategy, and its military power has to be spread out globally. The Chinese, by contrast, have a regional strategy. And so their spending and their assets can be focused regionally. And so what you see today is not only do the Chinese outnumber the United States in many categories of military arms within the region, but their arms are sometimes much more modern than ours. You add to that the heightened level of spending and the fact that the yuan can go further than the dollar in terms of purchasing power. And you see a Chinese Navy that outnumbers the American Navy by a fairly good margin, and that gap is just growing. You also see a China that's playing in its own backyard, as opposed to the United States that's playing an away game. It's been playing an away game for the last 75 years. We're expeditionary force, and so we rely on bases and ports of our allies and potentially coalition partners, whereas this is China's backyard, so it can operate from its home turf.
So active defense is a concept that the PRC holds that it is strategically defensive, but it can be operationally and tactically offensive. For example, active defense, despite being defensive in concept, would not rule out a preemptive strike if the leadership of the PLA and the PRC perceived that China was under a direct threat.
So where the Chinese are at now, if you picture it as kind of a graph of technology, of capability, they're starting to reach the cutting edge in a lot of ways. So that line where it was going up very quickly for a long time, it's starting to level off now because they're no longer able to do things like steal technologies from other countries because the technology doesn't exist anywhere yet. So effects like that, the rapidity of their development is starting to slow down. But at the same time, they're starting to reach peer status on a lot of different systems. So some of the highest profile systems, the things that they've invested the most resources in, ground-based air defense, particularly long-range surface-to-air missiles. They have built one of the world's best IADs. And they are continuously extending that out from where it was initially once just based strictly deep within China. Now it's hundreds of kilometers out into the near seas thanks to the range of their systems and to the establishment of increasingly forward bases. The naval expansion has been one of the largest in human history. They've built surface combatants that appear to be as modern as any on the planet. They have actively scanned radars and very effective long-range missiles, very capable anti-submarine systems. And they've built this huge number of surface combatants. It seems like almost, not quite instantaneously, but very, very quickly, a huge shipbuilding program that churned out these increasingly capable surface combatants. And of course, the centerpiece of this is the aircraft carrier. They have been investing huge resources in building a carrier capability with not just with the idea of influencing operations in the Western Pacific, but potentially being able to deploy a carrier group anywhere in the world and be able to project that power, be able to back an expeditionary force with serious modern air power anywhere in the world. You have other smaller examples that they've essentially caught up to the West with regard to their armor capability. They're both tanks and APC, IFV systems are mostly comparable to what we see in modernized Western militaries. And the last thing I'll talk about is their missile technology. And there's several different forms of missile technology that are of interest. And one of my favorite examples of where they've reached parity or maybe even surpassed their Western counterparts is in air-to-air missiles. And that kind of makes sense. You know, that things that the Chinese have done well historically, rocket motors and small electronics, that's an air-to-air missile. And so they had a kind of an advantage going into that contest, building newer and better air-to-air missiles. And they built some what appear on paper to be superb long-range air-to-air platforms. And the intent there is to be able to stand off against air forces that may be more capable, but now we've extended that range. We've removed that freedom of action, and we've made it more difficult for you to operate just by virtue of the fact that we have such dangerous missiles that we can sling at you. Of course, their ballistic missiles have been a flagship program for a long time, and that's not really any secret. But the quality of the missiles that they produced in recent years, both in terms of their range and in terms of the precision and accuracy they're capable of, is pretty remarkable. They have the world's largest and best ballistic missile fleet, and it continues to evolve. They now claim to have a missile that's capable of targeting ships that are actively cruising at sea. And in addition, very, very, very recently, we've seen the emergence of hypersonic glide vehicles as a new entry into their catalog.
At the end of the day, they have to have a nuclear deterrent against us. And the one that they had was probably inadequate. So that is a growing part of the force. And it's to deter us. And one could argue it's part of it's an adjunct to the anti-access area denial strategy. So that keeps us from coming inside the first island chain. So if you want to draw a line in the first island chain, just go South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, Singapore. That we have to break through where they are there. Well, it will be like the dog that caught the school bus. Okay? You've broken through the first island chain. Now what? What do you want to hit? What do you want to do? Where are you going? So, I mean, there's a whole argument that says what we should be doing is preventing them from getting out rather than trying to bust through. And that makes their job harder. So the numbers are out there, 2028, 2030, and we have to watch very closely what they're building. So the strategic deterrent piece is nukes, but it's also keeping us out of that, breaking through that island chain.
The CMPR had some very interesting assessments about China's nuclear force. And in particular, the specific claim, I think my numbers are about right here, is by 2030, the PLA will have over 1,000 nuclear warheads. And that is roughly in line with what the U.S. and Russia have as far as actively deliverable warheads at any given time. So they've had nuclear weapons for a long time. And to this point, China has shown absolutely no interest in discussing this. They have the U.S. and the Soviet Union or Russia, we have decades worth of very contentious and hard-fought negotiations that resulted in arms limitations treaties and the various mechanisms that are in place to ensure that nuclear parity, if you will. And if China is unwilling to join that dynamic, it has a lot of implications that will be very complicated over the next few decades, or the next decade, essentially, if they continue down the same path that they've been going down. I don't know how that's going to play out.
America is behind the power curve with regard to learning about China. It needs to get smart about China yesterday.
There was a major problem with the education level in the force, particularly with regard to China. There was still some legacy knowledge about the Russians going back to the Cold War, and lots of people got very familiar with the Red Army during the Cold War, and so that ended up being the model that we were given. We want to create a body of knowledge in the force today that is just as good as it was back during the Cold War.
So the new ATP will be infinitely useful for familiarizing the U.S. Army with Chinese tactics. It's important to remember that when we last looked at large-scale combat operations, that was in the 1990s, the outgrowth of the Cold War. The mindset of the adversary that we prepared against was predominantly Russian in scope, in structure, in mindset. And the Chinese think differently, they operate differently than do the Russians. And it's important to begin that process of familiarizing the U.S. Army with the People's Liberation Army, how it operates, how it thinks, from where does it draw its doctrine, because they're a completely different animal than the Russians.
The ATP, I hope, is something that is accessible. Particularly, when I was writing it, I had a couple of groups in mind. Number one, I had the Brigade S2 in mind. And so this is a lieutenant or captain, junior officer who they are responsible for replicating the threat in anything that brigade or battalion or whoever, any exercise, any training event that they're doing. They're the ones replicating the threat. And hopefully they are able to read this and replicate a Chinese tactical level echelon with a lot of accuracy, with a lot of confidence.
Tactical systems warfare principles make an interesting comparison with U.S. Mission Command. What the PLA tries to do in combat is to break down your network. They want to take out your communications. They want to take out vulnerable nodes so that enemy combat forces, from the PLA's perspective, are out there by themselves, isolated, cut off, unable to communicate, unable to receive logistical resupply, and see no point in further continued action. And in that, the PLA has two main tenets. They want to build and maintain their own system and network of warfighting functions, and they want to attack and reduce vulnerable nodes in the enemy's warfighting system. It's not necessarily focused on attriting the enemy's combat power as it is breaking down the enemy's network and rendering the enemy unable to believe that they have a chance for victory.
We don't know China and Russia today just as well as we knew the Soviet Union back in the 1980s. And that's really what the ATP turned into. As much as it's a model of how to build an OPFOR, it's also intended to educate the force on what's going on with China and how to adequately replicate everything about China, not just tactics, but the strategy, the mindset, the doctrine, and concepts and all of that stuff. So that's really what the ATP turned into over the period of its development.
So in 2016, Xi Jinping completely reformed the PLA. The structure that it had had, built on a Soviet model for 70 years previously, was changed. And they introduced the concept of the Combined Arms Brigade and the Combined Arms Battalion. And both of these were fairly new organizations. They did have these brigades and battalions before, but they were single function, single branch. And they introduced the idea of combined arms at a much lower echelon than they had before. And they completely did away with the division as a combat echelon. They still have a few in ceremonial-based units. But the Combined Arms Brigade, for the first time, introduced maneuver, fires, engineers, chemical defense, all into one organization at one echelon. And they made the brigade level immediately underneath what they call a group army, which is their equivalent of a U.S. Corps. These organizations, compared to a U.S. brigade combat team, are slightly larger because they tend to have 4 to 5 maneuver battalions instead of 3. But those individual battalions are a little bit smaller in terms of their composition. Interestingly, under the old system, battalions didn't have staffs. You had a commander, the commander had a commissar, and there was usually, they call it a master sergeant, but analogous to our sergeant major. Now you've got these embryonic battalion staffs at these combined arms battalions because now you push combined arms down to the battalion level. And 3 people is not nearly enough to manage an organization where you have maneuver, you have fires, you have air defense, engineers, all under the same 05 level organization. So they're remodeling themselves to look like us. And I think that's important for the officers attending CGSC to understand that they see us as the model to which they want to aspire.
So they try risky things, but they have a learning curve. And when somebody says, what's the danger of China? That they have a learning curve. That they don't keep doing the same dumb stuff over and over and over.
The conflict may be different than the conflict in the past, but it doesn't mean that there won't be conflict.
There are no quick wars with China. They're going to go on. Korea, still there. They along the 38th parallel, just where it was in July of 1953.
It may not be Cold War 2.0, but it's going to be around for a long time, and we have to acclimate to that reality, and we have to come up with a long-term strategy that not only accommodates the rise of China, but protects American interests in the future, operating alongside a peer competitor, because it will be a peer competitor. It's no longer going to be this. It's going to be more of this.
At the same time, the U.S. historically has proven itself very adaptable and rapidly so to mobilize against perceived threats. And while I certainly wouldn't predict armed conflict, wouldn't want to predict armed conflict, the United States has come to a realization that the U.S. and China have completely opposing geostrategic initiatives. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when our forces encounter one another. And they have a large and increasing sphere of influence.
It's got some deep, long-term issues that we need to think our way through.
The question remains, will America make that attitudinal adjustment that's necessary to live in a future world at peace, albeit competitive world, but at peace?
We have a tendency to think all wars are going to be short and we're going to be victorious. Maybe we ought to think a little bit through this. So I'll do what I do with my students. Do you really want to go to war with 1/5 of mankind with nuclear weapons in their home court? You need to think your way through that.
In April 1961, Lyndon B. Johnson, then Vice President of the United States, after a fact-finding tour of Southeast Asia, reported to President J.F. Kennedy, "The battle against communism must be joined in Southeast Asia with strength and determination to achieve success there, or the United States inevitably must surrender the Pacific and take up our defenses in our own shores. Asian communism is comprised and contained by the maintenance of free nations on the subcontinent. Without this inhibitory influence, the island outposts, Philippines, Japan, Taiwan, have no security, and the vast Pacific becomes a Red Sea."